As an atheist, what justification do you have for arguments for anything? For reason itself. This is why when people come to me and say, well, there's no evidence for God, I ask them, why is there evidence for anything? Because this is an orderly world, that's why. And our minds can ascertain truths about the real world. Why can our minds do that? Because I'm just a bunch of atoms thrown together by some accidental force? That doesn't make any sense. Why should my mind be able to understand truth and reason? And where do these laws of logic come from? And well, the laws of mathematics, they're better explained by theism.
All right, welcome everybody to the Unapologetic Apologist, episode 15. Super excited to have my next guest. He's coming back for a second time. He was here 10 episodes ago for episode number 5. This is 15. Dr. Frank Turek, thank you so much for coming back, sir.
Absolutely, Stelman. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good.
First, before we get into anything, I want to just give you a public thank you because you were the first guy to come on the show. Before you, it was it was just me in front of a camera monologuing. I had 25 or so subscribers, and since you kind of gave the show credibility. Now I've had Jay Werner-Wallace, Greg Kokel on. I've got Gary Habermas is coming up. Greg Kokel's going to come back on. So you really opened up the doors for me to be able to do all that. So I really want to thank you.
Well, we need more people doing this, so thanks for doing it.
Absolutely.
Work out on apologetics because so few people know about it. Most Christians don't even know about it. Forget the atheists. Christians don't even know about it.
Yeah, I went to my my assistant pastor because I wanted to talk to him about me teaching a class there, and he had never even heard of it before.
Really?
Yeah. So it's funny how that is. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of the college lecture because I've been watching you for so many years now. I've seen the lecture no more than less than 20 times, and it gets slightly different every time. You're constantly updating it, keeping it fresh. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the typical one I do, as you know, is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I used to do it in 2 parts. I used to do more of a deep dive on the evidence for God than I do now. So I would do, it's 4 parts. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? Is the New Testament reliable enough to tell us the truth about the resurrection? So I used to spend a lot more time on the truth and the God material. And so I would do an hour and a half, hour, 45 minutes on that and take questions. And then I'd come back for a second night to do miracles in the New Testament. But now I just do it. I summarize a lot more and I do it all in one night. Truth, God, miracles, New Testament, and then take questions. Because even if you double the amount of time you have to present, it's nothing like reading a book. I mean, you can get so much more out of reading and taking your time going through the material than you can in any seminar. But the seminars are there to kind of give you an overview from 10,000 feet and to encourage you to go deeper and to read more.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because when I went to see you, I kind of had a cheat sheet just for my memory. So when you ask things like, what are you going to say to somebody if they say there's no truth? I say, is that true?
Is that true? Yeah, you're one of the few guys that gets that.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember, again, long ago when I first started, following your work, you said, if you can learn how to apply the law of non-contradiction in conversations and debates, that's half of what you need to know. And that's really true. In all conversations, even I was having a conversation with a Catholic, and something just didn't feel right, and I realized that one of the big claims he made was it was self-defeating. He was kind of talking about how one of the reasons you need the Pope is because you have all these different interpretations of the scripture under Protestantism, and how do you know whose interpretation is correct? And that's why you need a Pope to kind of be inerrant under certain circumstances. And it dawned on me that the whole argument for the Pope is based on a certain interpretation of Matthew 16, where Christ is supposedly making Peter the first Pope and then somehow down on the line. But you can only get that from an interpretation of scripture. So whereas he was saying all you had without the Pope were interpretations, well, the very way you justify the Pope is through an interpretation.
Yes, there are many different ways to interpret that passage, by the way. So to build an entire doctrine on that passage without any other supporting passages, I think is a bit tenuous. Either way you go, whether you take the Catholic view or one of the several Protestant views. But yeah, it all gets back to, if you're going to use the Bible to show that a certain interpretation is right, then how do you know that your initial interpretation of that passage is right? Which is, an interesting question, hermeneutics, which is how you actually interpret not just the Bible, but any book. You can't get the principles of interpreting the Bible from the Bible because you would need to know how to interpret the Bible to begin with in order to get the hermeneutical principles out of it. It's sort of like in the old days, you probably don't remember this because you're a young man, but in the old days when you had a car without a keyless entry, you actually had to put your key in the door to open the car. If you locked your keys in the car, you couldn't get in the car. You'd have to have somebody come and figure out a way to get in there, AAA or something. It's sort of like that when it comes to the Bible. If you're trying to get the principles of interpreting the Bible from the Bible, you would have to already have those principles before you even read the Bible in order to interpret it. It's like sort of like, well, my keys are locked in the car. How do I get them out? Well, you got to unlock the door with the keys. Well, I can't. The keys are in the car. Right? So we get our principles of interpreting any book from reality, really, and common sense. So you can have all sorts of different disputes about it, but you really have to look at reality and use your common sense to try and figure out what a particular passage in any book says.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not a presuppositionalist.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, it's funny you say that. I actually remember when I was really little, my grandfather's car, it was like a new technology at the time. There was a code on the driver's side door, so if you accidentally locked your keys in there, you could punch it in. No, but I did want to ask you, you've been doing this for a lot of years. What would you say if you had to pick one would be your favorite argument for God's existence?
Yeah, that's kind of a tough one because I think the ones that I use are all really good. I actually think there are even better ones than the ones I use, tell you the truth. I think the arguments that Aquinas came up with and that are more popularized in the modern day by, say, Ed Feser are excellent arguments that seem to me bulletproof. The only problem is they're very difficult to explain to a lay audience in a limited period of time. And so you don't have that kind of time with a lay audience, and they're not as intuitive as the arguments from, say, the beginning of the universe or the design of the universe and the design of life or the moral argument. They're not quite as intuitive. But the ones that I do use, as you know, the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments, I think they're all good arguments. I think probably the one that makes the most impact on people personally is the moral argument, because you can ignore the beginning of the universe, you can ignore the design of the universe, but you really can't ignore morality because you deal with it every day. So I think from a personal, existential, we might say, point of view, the most relevant argument is the moral argument. But everything gets kicked off with the cosmological argument. I mean, if the universe did have a beginning, it seems to me, if space, matter, and time had a beginning, the cause can't be made of space, matter, and time. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent. All these attributes flow naturally from the data. So I always start with that argument because everything else does flow from that. But for people on the street, probably the moral argument is the more relevant argument. In fact, 70% of the questions that I get on a college campus are somehow morally related. They're related to morality somehow.
Yeah, the moral argument always was one of my favorites because it seemed to me that you can't really, what would you say? You can't really deny that objective morality is real unless you want to just kind of be advocating for nihilism or something like that.
Yeah,
And
you
then
want
it's
to deny your deepest intuitions, which is why Louise Antony, in her debate with William Lane Craig, she was an atheist. She actually admitted, she said, any case for moral relativism, or i.e. atheism, is built on weaker premises than the fact that you already know certain things are morally wrong. So, in other words, any argument for atheism requires a lot more faith than just believing what you already know, that, say, torturing babies for fun is wrong, or murdering 6 million people in a Holocaust is wrong. You already know that. That's, you would need a whole lot of evidence that to somehow overturn that, and atheism doesn't have it.
Yeah, it really doesn't, because I really thought about it, and it does seem to me that moral experience is on par with our experience of the external world. And so if someone's willing to say that kind of our morals are just somehow sort of an evolutionary adaptation, I say, well, why wouldn't the same thing apply to 2 + 2 = 4? We just believe that because it's survivally beneficial, but it doesn't have to, 2 + 2 doesn't have to equal 4 anywhere else in reality. And so it seems that if you're going to do that with reality or morality, then you just kind of have to do it with everything else.
Yeah, that was the issue that came up when I was had that little dialogue with the cosmic skeptic.
Yeah,
Young man's name. I'm trying to think of it now.
Alex O'Connor.
Yeah, that's it. Alex, very nice young man, very smart young man. We had a good conversation, but he was trying to say that morality is just a evolutionary adaptation or an evolutionary artifact, or we get all our morals from evolution. And my point is, well, if that's true, it's not just evolution that gives us morality, or it's not just morality that comes from evolution. All of our thoughts come from evolution, including the thought that morality comes from evolution, which has totally defeated your entire enterprise to try and know anything. See, that's the problem with hardcore atheism. It makes it impossible to know anything because their ideology of materialism undercuts reason, undercuts our ability to know anything, not just morality or anything else, but every thought we have, if atheism is right, if materialism is right, is the product of a non-intelligent process. It's just the product of physics. So why should we believe anything? So atheism makes reason impossible. It's ironic because many atheists claim we're the beacons of reason. Well, no, reason wouldn't work if atheism were true, if materialistic atheism were true, yet it does.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, once you've kind of established that there is some objective moral law, I've tried to come up with like devil's advocate responses to myself. I don't see a good way to ground that outside of a personal being, outside of humanity. Because, I debated an atheist a little bit ago, and he was basically saying you could ground it in some sort of natural law we haven't discovered yet. And I was pointing out all sorts of problems with that, but just one of them was that even if there were some sort of natural law of morality, I wouldn't be under any obligation to obey it.
Exactly. You're not under any obligation to obey gravity. You get on airplanes all the time, right? You don't have to obey gravity. There's no moral obligation, as you put it. That's the key, is the obligation end of it. Where does obligation comes from? We're obligated to persons. We're not obligated to the ground. I mean, if we want to jump or we want to fly, we can do that without any moral consequence. We're not violating a moral law when we violate the law of gravity, or better put, overpower the law of gravity. That's what we do. That's why, by the way, miracles are not violations of natural laws. They're overpowering of natural laws. Like, for example, I'm overpowering gravity right now by holding up this cup. Now, if I can overpower natural laws, can the God who created and sustains natural laws overpower them? Of course. So yeah, miracles are not violations. They're just overpowering of the laws God has set in place.
Yeah, I did a really long video on the Euthyphro dilemma, and before I kind of just got rid of it, I said that even if it were successful, it would still be better than atheism, because let's say God is just arbitrarily making up rules. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? He's still an authority figure that we have to obey. And so even if it's just arbitrary, that's better than atheism, where it's just one person against another's.
Well, that would presuppose that authority necessarily makes something right, and it doesn't. But what does make it right is, if God exists, his nature is good. And so the Euthyphro dilemma couldn't be true, because first of all, it's not really a dilemma, as you know, as you've been through it, because it's not that God is looking to a standard beyond him or God's arbitrary. God is the standard. If there is no standard, then God doesn't help you. Right? The standard is what we mean by goodness, and any deviation from that standard is what we mean by evil. And so that standard is goodness and is also personal to issue us commands. And so he does. And if this standard wasn't personal, then we would have no obligation to obey it, as you put out earlier. And it seems difficult for me to imagine how justice, because that's what God is just, how justice isn't really just. Because if God isn't personal, then how does he create, or how does he do justice in the end? How does he right all wrongs? He can't. He's not a person. He's a force like gravity. Well, how is a force able to right all wrongs? It can't. It's got to be a personal force that has an intellect that can right all wrongs. And only a personal being can do that. Now, technically, God is not a person. He is personal, but he's not a person like we are. So only a being that knows all things and has the power to right all things in the end can be just. So it doesn't appear to me that justice could exist like some Platonic form. That's what some atheists are known to say. Well, these virtues just exist somehow out there in reality. And well, if that's the case, how is justice really just if the being that ensures justice can't ensure it? Isn't personal, isn't all-knowing, doesn't have the power to right all wrongs. He wouldn't be just then. So justice, it seems, can only exist in a being that can actually do justice in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. And, nobody can really live inconsistently with that. Like, our whole legal system is based on that there is some real justice out there. And when we're trying to, I don't know, give somebody a prison sentence for a particular crime, we're operating under the presupposition that there is justice. We got to do it. And we don't act like people are just relatively advanced primates, that we're just kind of the accidents of nature and things. So people don't, even who are atheists or evolutionists, they don't live consistently with that worldview.
No, they don't. Now, we don't either, because it's impossible to live consistently with Christianity, because to be perfect, we can't do, only he can do it. But our beliefs are consistent with reality, whereas atheist beliefs are not consistent with reality. They can't even explain why they can reason, yet they claim to be beacons of reason. I mean, if we're molecular machines, as we said earlier, we're not reasoning, we're just reacting. They can't explain why there's a beginning, why there are objective moral values, as we just spoke about, where consciousness comes from. These things are much better explained by theism. Same thing with design, same thing with the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics. These are all best explained by theism. In fact, think about this. I've mentioned this before, I think in the book Stealing from God, that for atheism to be true, atheistic materialism to be true, every single spiritual experience in the history of the world has to be mistaken. Everyone. Now, is that possible? Yeah, it's possible. It's not likely. It's not likely at all. That every single person in the history of the world who thought they had some kind of a spiritual experience was mistaken? No, don't think so.
Yeah, and that's a big part of who we are as humans. It's not like we have one dream one time and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I like that was a good point you made earlier. I like how Steven Crowder says it. He says, if you have any moral standards at all, you're a hypocrite, because you can't possibly live up to your moral standards, and especially us as Christians, our moral standard is Christ. Right. So like, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask you, because in preparation for the last interview we did, I just read Correct Not Politically Correct, and I didn't get to ask you about a point I wanted to. And it's actually funny. You were also how I got into politics. I remember it was a couple of years ago, because it was leading up to the 2016 election. And so Bernie Sanders, the socialism was becoming real popular again. And you had done an episode on your podcast about socialism. And I listened to that, and I just got hooked right there. And I even took a political science class because of that. And I started like going back in the archives and listening to your conversations with Jay Richards.
Oh yeah,
and everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I went and got his book, Money, Green, and God. And so now here we are years later, and I'm always studying politics. But I did want to ask about your opinion on same-sex marriage, because so I read the book and I agree with everything in the book. I think I just come to a slightly different conclusion than you do, and so I kind of line up more with Ben Shapiro on this. I think the government should get out of the business of marriage, because even before we had same-sex marriage, the liberalization of the divorce laws in the 60s kind of made marriage less about children and just more about the feelings of adults at that point. And so my personal opinion is I don't think the government should be promoting any marriage, because most of what the government gets into, they ruin. And so I think if they weren't kind of promoting it from a political end, it would become more of a religious institution again. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea, but when you analyze it a little bit more closely, you realize that won't work. And for this main reason, who is going to go after the deadbeat dad who leaves his wife and 6 kids and refuses to pay any child support or alimony? The church? The synagogue? No, it's not going to happen. You need the strong arm of government to ensure that that guy pays what he owes and takes care of the family he left. So if for no other reason you need the government involved in marriage, it's for that. But let me go back to the real reason the government's involved in marriage, and this is what we unpack in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. The government's not involved in marriage to recognize romantic affinities between adults. I mean, why should the government care that John loves Mary or Bill loves Steve, if you want to go in that direction? Well, what interest does the government have in recognizing that relationship? None. The reason the government's involved in marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society. Because when a man and a woman come together and procreate, they actually make a firmer, stronger society that is perpetuated through their union. When the biological family is strong, the government has to do less. When the biological family breaks up, then the government tries to step in and take care of all the things that the family used to do. You know, the 80% of the prisons, or I should say 80% of the people who commit crimes and wind up in prison in our country come from fatherless homes, broken homes. When the family stays together, the mother and father stay together and they bring up children, everybody benefits. When they don't, then kids wind up getting into trouble, which means the government tries to step in to alleviate that through the prison system or through welfare programs. When abortion goes up, crime goes up, police forces get bigger, which means taxes go up, expenditures go up, deficits run higher. If all that could be reversed and people stayed together, then the government would be smaller, tax base or the tax rate would be lower, which means people would have more money, the economy would be better. This is why it's silly, Stelman, when people say I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal. The reason we have fiscal problems is because we have social problems. We're spending so much money trying to take care of our immorality that if we could just be more moral by keeping the family together, we'd have more money and a better economy. But people don't always make that connection.
Yeah, and it's not even close when you look at it statistically. Kids who have married mommy and daddy in the household, they're more likely to graduate high school, they're more likely to get a job, hold job, they're more likely to get married, have a family of their own, they're more likely to stay out of prison, they're more likely to be, mentally well adjusted.
Yes.
And in opposing households, the rate of the opposite of that goes up an alarming amount. And that's a point I hadn't considered before about the government being kind of needed to keep fathers responsible. So then my follow-up question would be, so what do we do now that we've gotten to this place in society where, first of all, the no-fault divorce, and then especially with the same-sex marriage, where would we go from here?
Well, that's still the biggest problem, is no-fault divorce. It wasn't necessarily the LGBTQ movement that ultimately brought us same-sex marriage. It was heterosexuals who made marriage more just about the romantic affinity of adults. And the first governor that signed no-fault divorce was Ronald Reagan back in like 1969 or 1970. And he later regretted doing that, but that spread all the way across the country. And so now what we've made marriage is just about the romantic affinities of adults, and it has nothing to do with children. Well, if marriage has nothing to do with children, then why not let same-sex people, marry one another is the idea. You marry who you love, right? It's all about romance. So it's really the heterosexuals that have brought this on. What we need to do is we need to make it more difficult to get a divorce. And we need to highlight the idea that marriage is about coming together, not just for companionship and romance, but to perpetuate and stabilize society. That's really what it's about. That's why the government's involved to begin with. And the only union that can really do that consistently, of course, is between a man and a woman. That's why that relationship should be the only relationship recognized as marriage. This has nothing to do with bigotry or intolerance or any of that. It has to do with just the natural realities. It's not bigotry, it's biology. This is just the way things work. Men and women are different. When they come together, they can bring forth children. Two men can't do that. Two women can't do that. Oh, they can get artificial insemination and all. Oh, yeah, they can do that. But men and women are different when it comes to parenting. Everybody knows this. Mothers are different than fathers. Fathers are different than mothers. And kids do better when they have a mother and a father. That's why that should be the ideal. That's why that should be the one sexual relationship that is recognized above all others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you just said there we're gonna talk about abortion in just a second, but I did want to just get your thoughts on this because I thought of you when I heard it. So Matt Walsh, I don't know if you follow Matt Walsh. He tweeted this out, and it just made me think of you because you wrote that article about the contradictions in the
Right,
LGBTQ,
right.
and he wrote this tweet. It said, "Gender is a social construct, but I am woman. Hear me roar. But anyone can be a woman, but no uterus, no opinion. But trans women are women, but I demand women's rights. But men are women, but men are scum, but drag."
Yeah, well, Matt is onto something here. The whole problem with the T in the LGBT movement for the people who are L, G, and B, and I guess the Q is queer, right? I guess that's what that's, or is it questioning? It's one of the two. I can't remember. But in
I
any
think
event,
it was queer, and then that became offensive, so that they changed it to questioning.
well, the T, the problem with the T, as even many same-sex advocates will admit, like for example, Andrew Sullivan, he says you're erasing women when you erase gender, and you're erasing homosexuality when you erase gender. In fact, you're erasing everything. Homosexuality presupposes that the genders are distinct. If they weren't, then why not just marry somebody of the opposite sex? The very reason that you want a same-sex person, a same-sex attracted person wants same-sex marriage is so they could marry somebody of the same sex precisely because they know the sexes are different. If they weren't different, they wouldn't be arguing for same-sex marriage. So the T presupposes, or I should say the homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, all that presupposes gender gender distinctions. There are two genders, and they make a difference. And so the T is really fighting against the other letters in the acronym. And it's going to be interesting to see where this winds up. Tragically, probably nowhere good, because the world appears to have gone crazy. And the problem is that it's people want to teach this to our kids now, and to try and encourage people to get surgery that is impossible to accomplish. You can't change your biology. You can change your body, but you can't change your biology. To have them do that is a tragedy, especially when after the surgery, people who consider themselves transgender are 19 times more likely to commit suicide than the general public. 19 times more likely. It's Dr. Paul McHugh from Johns Hopkins University likens transgenderism or gender dysphoria to anorexia. It's a mental disorder. It's when you have a mismatch between your mind and your body. We would never say to an anorexic, let me give you liposuction because you think you're fat when you really aren't. Well, that's the same thing we're saying to the people who are claiming some sort of gender confusion. We're basically giving them something that won't help them, it will hurt them by giving them this surgery. We have to help them through psychiatry, not through surgery, with their issue.
Yeah, that's why it kind of gets on my nerves sometimes how far the left pushes, because this is a situation where we should have like the utmost compassion for people who struggle with this,
Of course.
but then the left they push so far that we kind of have to push back, kind of, and sometimes it seems harsh and in a way that seems uncompassionate because they're just forcing it, like you said, on children. Like that's child abuse, because you can't. They'll say, oh, you can just take them off the hormones and they'll go through late puberty. No, you've kind of messed them up for a while, and especially when you consider that 80 to 90% of kids who claim they're transgender grow out of it.
Of course.
And so what's happening is that 40% suicide rate in the transgender community, that's not in every single kid who claims they're transgendered because they're going to grow out of it. But if you give them hormones, then you're locking them in to that 40% suicide rate. So it's just absolutely ridiculous.
And I think what we need to emphasize here, at least if we're reasoning correctly here, and of course we can always be corrected on our reasoning, we ought to be making the case that we're not saying this just because we have some sort of religious principle or we want to impose any religious principle or that kind of thing, although our religion might inform our morality. We're claiming that the values that we think are the right values are right and true for everybody. They're not my values, they're not your values, they're the values, the one that Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. So when people say to me, don't impose your morality on me, I say, this is not my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. We think this morality is based on reality. And this reality, if we live by it, is better for everyone. So We're not just saying, oh, this is good for us, and if we get enough power, we're going to impose that on you. We think that this is best for everyone. And if you think it's not best for everyone, give us some arguments that show us it's not best for everyone. In other words, we're trying to impose the moral law that founded this country. It's not our sectarian religion. We're not trying to tell people where, when, how, or if to worship, but we are trying to tell people how we ought to behave as a society. And everybody's trying to do that. All laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality. And people say, don't impose your morality. I say, it's not mine. It's not yours. It happens to be the morality. And if you have a problem with the morality, you don't have a problem with me. I didn't make it up. You have a problem with the creator, whose nature is the ground for this.
Yeah, take it up with him.
That's right.
Yeah, normally when I'm having these kinds of conversations, especially in the political arena, I try as often as I can to make a secular argument for things. I never say, well, the Bible says so, therefore this is what we should do. It's not really a
secular argument, it's more of a natural law argument when you say that. And if you're going to make a secular argument, then it's not really an argument at all, because there is no grounding for secular ethics. It's just your opinion then. But if you're appealing to a theistic God, that the Declaration of Independence appeals to, and his nature endowing our creator with certain inalienable rights, if you're appealing to that, well, that's something objective. If you're just appealing to, well, this government, this secular government says, well, who says that secular government is right? We have to appeal to something beyond us. If nothing is beyond us, then we can't say the Nazis were wrong. We shouldn't have convicted the Nazis at Nuremberg. We can't say that our society is better or worse than any other society. There's got to be an external standard beyond us, and that's what God's nature is.
Yeah, that's a good correction. I should say natural law argument. I was, no, I did want to ask you, because the last time we talked, I think it was like almost right after our interview, New York passed that law legalizing abortion all the way up to 9 months. Mm-hmm. And of course they said, well, it's just for in case of the health of the mother. But then when you actually looked at like the fine print, really a doctor could just say it for any reason. And when that happened, I kind of just assumed, yeah, this was inevitable. This was the direction our country was always going in, because, you know, Roe v. Wade had kind of just become the norm. It was just, that was just kind of understood that even us who were pro-life, this apparently was just the ethics of the government. And then so New York passed their law, and I thought, okay, this is unfortunate, but this is going to be the inevitable direction. And then all of a sudden you got Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. These places started passing almost abortion bans, these heartbeat bills. And then, of course, you had other places like Vermont following in New York's direction. And so we were kind of getting this divide. And so now I'm thinking, oh, maybe the pro-lifers, maybe it won't be so just as easy as it seemed for the pro-choicers. So what are your thoughts on all that that's going on?
Well, I think that there's been a backlash to what New York has done, which was horrific, by the way. I mean, basically, it's an infanticide. You just kill the baby if you don't want it. Mm-hmm. And that's what all abortion is, in my view, because it is a human being. It's just much more obvious when it's just come out of the birth canal.
Well, they kind of shown their hand, because you even had Governor Northam, I think it was, basically saying even a baby who was already born, but then we'll have a discussion. And then even that, what was that law? That would say that a baby who survives a botched abortion, the Born Alive Act, every single Democrat voted against that.
I know, it's crazy. This is where those people are for some reason. So I don't know where it's all going to go. I'm for any law that reduces the number of abortions. You know, technically, a human being is a human being from the moment of conception. So if the law were to ban abortions except for the life of the mother, I'd be all for that. But if that's not politically viable at this point, I'll take any law that reduces the number of abortions. The heartbeat law, a lot of people will come up to you and say, well, what about rape and incest? And what I say to that is a couple things. From a philosophical perspective, if I had a toddler right here that was born as the result of rape, do I have the right to kill it? No, of course not. Still a human being. So what's your argument? But what I like to say to people who bring that up is I like to say, well, let me ask you a question. If we were to have a law that would allow abortion for rape and incest and life of the mother, would you join me in support of that law to ban all convenience abortions? 99 times out of 10, the other person's going to say no. In other words, rape and incest is just a smokescreen they're throwing out there. They're throwing out the hardest cases to try and somehow justify abortion. If you were to say, I'll be for a law that allows abortion for rape and incest, even though I think that's still a human being, politically, I'll go for that if all convenience abortions are taken off the table. Join me in that. They're still going to say no. So you'd say, well, why bring rape and incest up? Because that's not really your issue. You think abortion should be legal all the time. Well, what justification do you have for that? They don't.
Yeah, that's one thing I say. Yeah, I'll answer the question about rape and incest, but can we first stipulate that all the other abortions are bad? It's only rape and incest you have a problem with, and of course they say no.
Yeah.
I did very briefly because I was going to do this just kind of as a solo video, but since I have you here and you have kind of helped me develop my opinion on this, there's just a couple of memes I wanted to go through real quick. One of them, it shows a homeless child and it says, "A life is not saved just by letting it be born. Let that sit in your conscience." So essentially saying, well, what are we going to do? And to me, it's just like, so it's better that the kid be killed, because we're not talking about not conceiving the kid as opposed to letting it be homeless. We're talking about actively killing it in the womb.
Yeah, well, why don't we just round up all the poor kids and kill them then, according to that meme? How does that make any sense? Because somebody has difficulty in life, that means they don't have a right to life? I don't understand that. I mean, it obviously we're all going to suffer at some point in life. Does that mean we should all just go kill ourselves? No, I don't. That doesn't follow.
Yeah, there was one here I was looking for that said, oh yeah, it says you can be anti-abortion for yourself and pro-choice for anyone who isn't you because you realize you shouldn't get to make rules for someone else's body. And yeah, basically, if you're not going to carry the child, you don't get to have an opinion.
Okay, well, first of all, that's a moral position. What grounding do they have for that, right? That's a moral position. I mean, you can think of many laws that are imposed on us that require us to do something we might not want to do, like pay taxes, for example. We might not want to pay taxes, but we have an obligation to pay taxes. So there are some laws that put burdens on us, even though they may impinge on our freedoms. So laws impinge on our freedoms all the time. I'm not free to drive 100 miles an hour down my side street. Okay, that impinges on my freedom, but why? Because life is valuable. That's why. Laws imply a right to life. I can't go steal my neighbor's property. That may impinge on my freedom, but it's still something that is good for society to do. So the person who comes up with this meme is assuming that any law which impinges on any freedom I might have or causes me some sort of burden can't be a law. Well, that's all laws do that.
Yeah, and something's, some people might not like to hear. I'm sorry, but you can't be pro-life for yourself and pro-choice for everyone else. You're just not pro-life then. If you're saying, well, I wouldn't kill an innocent child, but anybody else can, and doctors can.
If you put the word slavery in that, you would show the absurdity of it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like saying, it's similar to the meme that says, if you're not a woman, you have no right to talk about this issue. Well, that would be like a farmer saying, if you're not a farmer, you have no right to talk about slavery. If you're not a cotton farmer, look, if you're going to outlaw slavery, I lose all my workers. That really burdens me. So, no, that doesn't make any sense. The morality of the issue or immorality of the issue is based on God's nature. It's not based on whether you're a man or a woman, a slave owner or a slave. It's based on whether or not the behavior lines up with God's nature or doesn't. Mm-hmm. So these are silly memes that people come up with that they haven't really thought through.
Yeah, and there's a couple things in there. Like, if someone's going to say, white men don't get an opinion on this, well, guess what? It was 9 white men who passed Roe v. Wade. So according to that logic, we should overturn that law. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you're attributing race or gender to arguments, that's just illegitimate. Arguments don't have race or gender. Arguments are arguments. They're either valid or they're not.
Yeah. Oh, and then there was one in here, and that I did respond to this, but it said, if you no longer have an EEG, a regular wave pattern, you're considered brain dead, which is considered the legal, medical, and scientific definition death, despite your beating heart. So it was in response to these heartbeat bills. And so this means an organism such as a fetus is by definition not alive due to the lack of EEG, which means a fetus can't be murdered by legal, scientific, and medical terms. Abortion is not murder. And basically, I responded to that. I said, okay, well, suppose you have someone who's legally declared brain dead, right? They're in a coma. I said, but you know they're going to wake up in 9 months. And they're going to be perfectly healthy. They're going to be perfectly fine, perfectly functioning brain. I said, do you have a right to chop them up and kill them?
Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm.
That's just what I wrote.
Yeah. It's again more ways of trying to justify some immoral act that people want to commit for their own convenience. And look, if there's any doubt as to when life begins, then you ought to give the benefit of the doubt to life. You know, if you're out hunting and you hear a rustling in the bushes and you're unsure whether that's your hunting partner or a deer, I mean, do you shoot first and ask questions later? No, you verify it's a deer or whatever you're going after before you shoot into the bushes. The same thing is true if you're up late one night or you hear a rustling at the door and you don't know whether it's a thief coming in the door or your teenage daughter. Do you shoot through the door or do you verify who it is before? No, you make sure you're given the benefit of the doubt that it could be somebody really important before you shoot. And so if there's any ambiguity as to when life begins, you give the benefit of the doubt to life. Same thing is true with your illustration. If the thing's going to wake up 9 months later, yeah, of course you don't have the right to kill it.
Yeah, Steven Crowder has a similar example he uses in debates with people. He'll say, suppose you're driving home one night and you see, a person walk out in the street, and assuming you have time to stop, do you stop? And they always say, yeah, of course I'd stop. It says, okay, now suppose you're driving at night, you see a shape, you're not sure if it's a person or not, but do you stop? And the idea is, yeah, of course I'd stop, because you err on the side of not ending a life.
A lion in the road, you don't know whether it's a body or, a sack of potatoes. Same thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to this idea of, men wanting to control women's bodies, and, that's just nonsense. Like, you would think, if anything, if men have interest in controlling women's bodies, you can think of the one reason that would be, right? And so, obviously, if that were your kind of underhanded tactic at getting at women's bodies, you'd actually be pro-abortion, because making it easier for people not to have to deal with children as a consequence of irresponsible behavior, that's obviously where you would line up. Yeah, it wouldn't just be this arbitrary...
That is exactly what has happened, tragically. Women are now pressured to get abortions because it's legal. And, boyfriends will drive their so-called girlfriends, who they don't really love because they're not committed to them, to the abortion clinic and give them the money to go have the abortion. So it's putting pressure on people to actually do immoral behavior. The other point there is, it doesn't really matter what the motivation is of somebody who thinks abortion is wrong. They could have a good motivation or a bad motivation. That's not really the point. The point is abortion morally wrong? And the answer is yes. So to say, well, you're just saying this because you have this motivation. Well, maybe I do. That doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Right. That would just be the genetic fallacy, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. All right. So moving on, before we go, I did want to ask you a little bit about your view on time, because I've been...
That's dumb.
Nice
try.
Yeah. No, because it's something that's really piqued my interest for some reason. I've been reading a lot of Dr. Craig and Time and Eternity. And I've just gotten really interested because my friend, I think, has a view that's similar to yours, which is God remains timeless after he creates the universe. And then Craig's point of view is God becomes temporal with the creation of the universe. And so far with the arguments, I seem to line up more with Craig. And the reason for that is not because I think God somehow enters into our space-time continuum, right? And then so he's kind of subject to time like we are. Mm-hmm. Rather, I see it as, especially if we adopt an A theory of time, that God has an actual sequential relationship to time. And so, for example, even if the only two states are, here's God existing timelessly without the universe, and then here's God existing, let's say, still timelessly, but with the creation of the universe, that's still a sequential state, one being past and one being present. And so to me, if that's the case, then it would seem that God becomes temporal with the creation of the universe. So
I'm not sure what is meant by God becomes temporal. In his nature? What does that mean? And I think I may have read Dr. Craig's book, but it was many years ago. And I'm very hesitant to disagree with Dr. Craig on virtually anything. And maybe he has an insight I haven't thought about. But it seems to me that I need definition as to what it means that God becomes temporal. Yes, God's acts enter into time, but that doesn't mean his nature is in time.
Right.
He manifests himself like he does in the Old Testament when you see two Yahwehs showing up, say in Judges 6 or a couple other places in the Old Testament. He manifests himself in an angel or some kind of appearance. But that doesn't mean God's nature is necessarily in time and that he is temporal now. If he was temporal, how could he know the future? The idea that he's outside of time and sees everything all at once allows him to know the future.
So two things I have there. So first, I think that the theory of middle knowledge solves the problem of him knowing the future. Is he, even though the future doesn't exist yet, he created all natural parts of reality, so he knows what that's going to happen, and he knows his creatures so well that he knows what we would freely do under any given set of circumstances.
I agree with all that, yeah.
Okay, and then so the second thing would be to say, well, if the reason he knew the future was because he was out of time, would that not inadvertently advocate for the B theory of time? Because it would kind of seem to suggest that God can see all points of time at once, and since he can see the future points of time, that's how he knows.
Well, no, it doesn't mean that the future time has become actualized yet. It just means that God knows what's going to happen because he knows all things. So, again, I would need further definition as to what Dr. Craig means by God enters time, because I agree his acts enter time, right? Mm-hmm. And he may manifest himself in time at certain occasions, but how do you get a timeless nature into time? I don't know if I have time to even think about that.
Well, so here's something that struck me about it was because my other friend kind of has a view where, okay, here's God, he's timeless, and then here's time, and like you said, he can enter into time at different instances and act in it, but then he can still ultimately be in this timeless state. Mm-hmm. For me, when I think about, for example, the incarnation of Christ, I think that if God is somehow timeless out here, and then his act of being incarnated is kind of separate from that in our space-time continuum, then in his present state of being timeless, you couldn't actually answer the question as to when he became incarnated in Christ. So my sense of him being temporal now would mean that there was a moment when the incarnation was something that he was going to do. And now it's the case that that's something he already did, and he doesn't have to suffer because his suffering was past tense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but when Christ came to earth, he had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, and he gave up, according to Philippians 2, the privileges of his divine nature when he was on earth. So when Jesus dies on earth, God doesn't die, as you know.
Right.
God still goes on. So I don't know if the incarnation necessarily means that God's divine nature has entered into time. His human nature.
Right, I agree with that.
Okay, so well, it's an interesting topic. I'm not sure, and again, I haven't read Dr. Craig's book in a long time, and I remember reading this. I'm not sure what problem it solves or why he thinks and if he thinks God's nature is in time, because there's a problem when it comes to the attributes of God, and if you give up one of them, all of them ultimately get pulled overboard. It's like throwing one of those buoys off one of those, boats. You throw off one buoy and they're all connected by ropes or lines, and the next buoy goes off. The next buoy goes off. If you start throwing overboard some of the classic attributes of the God of the Bible, you wind up throwing up all of them. They're all tethered together. And so I don't know if I can explain that in an example right now. Well, let's take some divine simplicity, for example. If you say God is made of parts and he's not simple, then you've given up God being the creator, because all created things are made of parts, and the uncreated creator isn't made of parts, because something that's made of parts is composed, which means it has to be composed by something external to it, which means there has to be a being beyond that composed being. If you're saying God is not simple and is made of parts, then he's not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncomposed. He's the great I am. He just exists. He doesn't exist by nature of someone putting him together. He exists necessarily. And he's timeless. He didn't have a beginning. He's not going to have an end. When you say there's time, does that mean he's not eternal anymore? I mean, there's so many issues that come up with that.
So this is just off the top of my head, so I could easily be very mistaken about this. But could it be the case that timelessness isn't an attribute like omniscience or omnipotence is? Rather, it's a consequence of God being the sole ultimate reality. So as the sole ultimate reality, that's void of anything contingent, right? And so time we could think of as a contingent property. So since God is void of contingent properties, his timelessness is kind of a secondary result of being that sole ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if God does become temporal, he's still all powerful, he's still omniscient, and he doesn't age like humans do, so he's not going to grow weak over time. So he still extends into eternity.
Yeah, again, it depends on what you mean. God becomes temporal. What does that mean? Does that mean God changes? See, now we're getting rid of God's unchangeability or immutability by saying he was timeless at one point, and now he goes to he's in time now. So now he's changed. And so now all these attributes that typically are tethered together start going over the boat.
Fair enough. So what if by God becomes temporal, all I mean is that, for example, right now is the present moment to God, and yesterday that was the present to him, and tomorrow that will be the present to him. And so even if his essential divine nature isn't changing, he still bears an objective relationship to time as it unfolds. Would that be fair?
He always knew what yesterday would be, today would be, and what tomorrow will be to us. So it's really difficult to conceptualize some of this because we're locked in time and we can't imagine what it's like not to get experiences and gain new information. But God knows things not in the way we know it, right? God is knowledge, we have knowledge. God is knowledge, we get knowledge.
Yes, I agree. So on your view, though, would God not experience distinct present moments from one another?
I don't think that God experiences distinct present moments like we do. He just knows them. Just like God doesn't reason to conclusions like we do. God doesn't, we reason to conclusions. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We go through a progression. God doesn't go through that logical progression. God just knows all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal. So there's no sequence in God's thought.
No, yeah. So to me that has
time that would imply he gets sequence.
Well, see, I don't think, again, God is adding knowledge. I think he always knew what yesterday would be. He always knew what today would be. He always knew what tomorrow would be. Nevertheless, I do think that God looks at today as the present moment. He no longer looks at yesterday as the present moment. And then when tomorrow comes, that will be the present moment. And none of his divine nature or knowledge has to change.
Well, perhaps not. I'd have to think about it more. I don't know what problem's being solved by suggesting God's in time, though. It's a dangerous road to go down, as I say, because all these attributes are tethered to one another.
Yeah. Well, so the only problem I think is often, I could be wrong about this, because me and my friend were having a conversation about it, and he was like hardcore holding to the view that God is still timeless, that he doesn't experience distinct present moments like we do. Like that's just kind of a subjective feature of our experience. And so I said, well, then would God at least experience two present moments? The first being his existing timelessly without the creation of the universe, and then when he creates the universe, now it's a new reality.
What you're implying there is that God somehow gets new information through experience, and he doesn't. He just is all knowledge. So before he created the universe from our perspective, he knew what it was like to have a universe, even though he hadn't created it yet.
But he just didn't have it yet, right?
Right, but there's no new information coming to God.
I agree there's no new information, but so here he exists without the universe, and now he exists with the universe. No new information, but it's two different.
But if he's outside of time,
states.
it's irrelevant to him in that sense. Then nothing's changed from his perspective because he's not in time.
Well, what's changed is that the universe exists now, whereas it didn't before.
From our perspective, yeah, but from God's perspective, he always knew what it was like to have a universe, even though from our perspective it hadn't happened yet. He already knows what it's like in 2050.
Yeah, but you would agree that for God, from God's perspective, there was a time when the universe didn't exist. And I know that doesn't really make any sense because you can't say a time when there was no time.
Yeah, I think this topic is not something we're going to get anywhere on right now.
Fair enough. I wanted to understand your view better because I wasn't quite sure where you stood on it.
Even if I haven't thought it completely through, I would be very wary to say something like God is in time now, whatever that means.
Yeah, well,
as I say, all the attributes are tethered to one another.
Yeah, I agree. For me, the only problem solved is because where we ended up getting in the conversation was my friend said, well, then he kind of advocated for the B theory of time, right? Because God knows all moments. And to us, it seems like there's distinct moments, but to God, they're not distinct. He knows them all. And then,
but that doesn't mean that's not the B theory of time. The B theory of time says that, if I even remember it correctly, says that all moments are already actualized.
Yes.
Well, they're not already actualized from our perspective. They may be from God's perspective.
Well, that would still be the B theory of time.
But we're in a timeline. We're in time right now.
Yes, we are.
2050 hasn't happened yet. We're heading there.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still hold to the A theory of time from our perspective, even though God knows all things. In fact, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I wish I had the quote in front of me. I don't have it right now. But Einstein's theory of general relativity points out that any being outside of the space-time continuum would see everything at once.
Okay.
So he's outside of, before the universe is created ontologically not chronologically before the universe is created, the being that's outside the universe sees everything at once. That's according to the Stanford, I'll see if I can find it real quickly. I know we're running out of time here, but the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Let me see if I can find it. You just go on to the next thing, man, as I'm looking for this. Go ahead.
Okay. No, well, I just wanted to say, not to move on for this. For me, the problem it solves is it seems to me if you follow that all the way to its end, you end up having a universe that's eternal with God, even though it would still technically be subject to his creative powers, like some people believe the abstract objects are. And so it seems if you kind of get rid of momentary experiences from God's perspective, it all becomes one experience where the universe is eternal with him. So that's just my perspective. It solves that problem. Is it doesn't have an eternal universe. Now, I'm not saddling you with that belief, though.
Yeah, you have to be aware, though, because you could be creating a whole bunch of other trouble. Let me just see if I'm looking for a particular quote here.
Yeah.
Here it is. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about Plato, actually, and eternity. Quote, the theory of relativity is generally taken to support the idea that the universe is a four-dimensional space-time block, that time is a matter of perspective, and that an ideal knower outside the universe would observe it all at once. Anyway, interesting quote. In the last minutes, let's finish it up on something else, because
Well, so I did want to ask you. I had this written down. I wanted to ask you, play devil's advocate for a minute. What do you think would be the best case or argument someone can make for atheism, or at least against God, maybe?
Oh well, against God would be not the existence of evil, but the persistence of evil or the amount of evil, because you can't get rid of God by saying evil exists. Because that just presupposes God does exist. Because if evil exists, good must exist. And if good exists, then God must exist, in an objective sense anyway. So evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there. But you might say, well, if this good God does exist, I know he can allow some evil, but look, there appears to be some evil that just has no good purpose. We don't want to see it. We see any good purpose in a baby dying, or some tsunami wiping out 150,000 people or whatever. What good purpose can come from that? That would probably be the best argument you could make. It doesn't get rid of God, but it may get rid of perhaps
a personal God.
No, you still need a personal God, and you still need a loving God, because without love, you don't even have evil. You don't have the juxtaposition.
Yeah.
It really doesn't get rid of God. It just questions God's actions.
Well, could the atheist maybe substitute the word evil for just suffering, right? Because suffering doesn't necessarily have to have a moral basis, even though the objection is still inherently a moral one.
Why is he's implying suffering's evil? Well, why is suffering evil? Honestly, there are no good arguments for atheism, because any argument you make presupposes a standard, and that standard has to be grounded in something outside yourself. Now, I'm not saying that the arguments for God necessarily prove Christianity. They don't. Cosmological argument could be Allah, right?
Yeah.
Teleological argument could be Allah. Moral argument can't be Allah, because Allah is arbitrary. So now you're getting closer to Christianity, and you combine those three. You've got to really look at the resurrection of Jesus to see if the Christian God is true.
Yeah.
If Jesus rose from the dead, then game over, Christianity's true. And so that's why we spend a lot of time on the resurrection. You don't get all the way to Christianity with one argument, except the resurrection, right? Every other argument could be another theistic God out there.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's a good argument against the resurrection? Because from my perspective, I think if I'm going to be an atheist, the best case scenario is I assume the Gospels are written hundreds of years after Jesus, right? Because then you can have lies emerging that much later. But for me, as someone who's looked at the evidence, and I know they were written early, it's harder to come up for an argument against it there.
Yeah, but again, as an atheist, let me just, again, not get down in the weeds on, whether the historical arguments are good or not. As an atheist, what justification do you have for arguments for anything? For reason itself. This is why when people come to me and say, well, there's no evidence for God, I ask them, why is there evidence for anything? Because this is an orderly world, that's why. And our minds can ascertain truths about the real world. Why can our minds do that? Because I'm just a bunch of atoms thrown together by some accidental force? That doesn't make any sense. Why should my mind be able to understand truth and reason? And where do these laws of logic come from? And the laws of mathematics, they're better explained by theism. Atheism actually discounts them. Atheism says they don't even exist. Because how can an immaterial law of logic exist if all that exists are materials? It can't. So atheism has neutered itself to know anything, whether or not God exists or anything else about the universe. So I don't think there are good arguments for atheism. Now, if an atheist wants to say, look, I believe in objective moral laws, or I believe in objective laws of logic, or I believe in objective laws of mathematics, I'm going to say, great. They're immaterial. How do you ground them? Where do they come from? So whether you're a materialistic atheist or you believe in the immaterial reality and you're still an atheist, you still have to ground those laws. What do you ground them in?
Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite quotes is actually from you. I heard it, I think, a couple of years ago. You said, when you look under the covers of atheism, you find that it's intellectually bankrupt.
Yes, it is. That's the end of the book, Stealing from God.
Mm.
And look, it's not just me saying this. Ravi Zacharias the other day was saying the same thing. Ed Feser was saying the same thing. Ed Feser, as you know, is the Catholic theologian out there at Pasadena City College, and wrote the book, The Last Superstition and 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. He was talking to Ben Shapiro. That's where I saw it. The Ben Shapiro Sunday special. And they were talking about all this, that it's just impossible to justify reason from an atheistic perspective. And yet that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say they're the reasonable ones. How can you be reasonable if everything's molecules in motion? And even if it's not molecules in motion, where do you ground reason?
Yeah. Absolutely. I could do this for another couple hours, but I know you're a busy man. I gotta let you go. I do want to say, because you just mentioned stealing from God, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but that is one of my favorite apologetic books out there. I recommend everybody go and get it. Do you have anything you want to let the audience know about before you go?
Well, just to have them go to our website, crossexamined.org, and download our app, 2 words in the App Store, Cross Examined. It's got all of our podcasts on there. It's got the TV show, which airs Wednesday night. That streams live there. And if they like our YouTube channel or subscribe to our YouTube channel, they'll see we put up a video a day, actually. Most of them are Q&A videos from the college campus. They're really short Q&A videos, so you can share them with others and be able to interact with them on an important question. Because look, if you send somebody a 40-minute video, they're not going to watch it. You send them a 4-minute Q&A video, they'll watch it. So in fact, if they go to our website and subscribe to our email, we'll send them one of those videos a week via email, and they can just share it with other folks.
Awesome. That's great. All right. Thank you so much for coming back. It really does mean the world to me.
All right. Thanks.
And I owe you such a big part of my success. Dr. Turek, sir, thank you so much for being here. I hope to get you back on soon.
All right. God bless, man. Thanks.